Welcome to the Heartland Author Podcast. I'm Aaron Apollo Camp. Today's episode consists of a first for this podcast. For the first time, I'm interviewing a traditionally published author. Today's guest on this podcast is Brandie June, the author of the young adult fantasy novel Gold Spun. I'm here with Brandie June, the author of the young adult fantasy novel Gold Spun. Brandie, welcome to the Heartland Author Podcast.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me.
Feel free to introduce yourself to our listeners.
Certainly. So as you mentioned, my name's Brandie June, and my debut novel, Gold Spun, came out in June. So it's a Rumpelstiltskin retelling told from the miller's daughter's point of view, except this time she's a con artist and Rumpelstiltskin is a mysterious fairy boy. So I've always just really loved fairy tales and mythology and had such a blast kind of reinventing this story.
Without spoiling too much of the book, explain what your book Gold Spun is about.
So it's a Rumpelstiltskin retelling, but I really wanted to give the miller's daughter more agency. So I have her as a con artist because this way she's the one convincing people that she can spin straw into gold as opposed to other people saying it on her behalf. So I really love all sorts of like morally gray characters and flawed heroes. So she's a good person, but she definitely has some flaws. So it's kind of her story.
Very fascinating. Now, is your book self-published or traditionally published?
It is traditionally published. The publisher is Camcat Books. They are a smaller independent publisher, rather new on the market, but growing quite quickly. So it's been a really interesting experience working with a publisher.
That is very interesting. You're the first guest I've had on this podcast who is a traditionally published author. So congratulations.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it was a long road to get here, and I know traditional versus self-publishing, there isn't one right way for everyone. It's kind of figuring out what works best for each author.
There are advantages and disadvantages of both self-publishing and traditional publishing.
Correct. A friend of mine who does fantastic job self-publishing put it once that a self-published author, you're sort of like you're the owner of a restaurant, so you have to do everything, but on the other hand, you also get control of everything. Whereas a traditionally published author, it's a little more like being the chef. So you're more focused on, one or two items. Although in these days, even traditionally published authors need to do a lot in the way of marketing and promotion.
That's a very good analogy, Brandie. Now, did you outline Gold Spun before writing it?
I did. I am. Through trial and error, I've found that I'm an outliner. I like to plot it out first, although once I'm actually in the middle of drafting, sometimes very frequently it will change from what I initially proposed, but at least to start, I like to come up with some sort of framework.
I asked this question because when I wrote my first book, which is a self-published ebook, called Lady in the Fast Lane back in October of 2019. I did not outline before writing it, and I really should have, because I found out through not writing that work to the best of my ability that I would be better suited to outlining before writing. And every author has their own preferences.
Yeah, the first stab I took at writing a book was pantsing, kind of writing by the seat of your pants. I didn't outline it. And it really was, as you mentioned, a lot of trial and error to find out what what style worked best for me.
Now, at the very beginning of this interview, I referred to your book as a young adult fantasy book. Would that be a correct description of it?
Yep, that is how I
Okay.
classify it.
Well, this question is about the fantasy genre, and what is your best advice to those who are considering writing fantasy?
I would suggest for people considering writing fantasy, first off, go for it. And for people who want to write anything, I suggest, go for it. Fantasy, in particular, I'd say just be as widely read as possible. Read a lot of fantasy, but also read other genres. Find out what you like about books and plots and settings, what you don't like, what works, what doesn't. And one of the best ways to do that is to read.
Now, are you writing or planning on writing more books?
I am. I am. I've actually signed with the publisher for the second book. So Gold Spun is going to be a duology. I'm currently deep at work with the sequel.
That is fantastic. Now, if you have a typical writing routine, what is your typical writing routine?
So it really depends what's going on with the rest of my week and where I am in a book. Because if I'm doing the say the rough draft, my process is somewhat different than if I'm doing, detailed edits. But being as I do work full time as well, a lot of times I will try to get up an hour before I need to get ready for work, so that way I have some time in the morning to write. Occasionally I will write during my lunch break, sometimes after work if I have the energy. And on top of that, I'll usually put several hours aside on the weekends to have some really bigger chunks of dedicated writing time.
Now, you said that you have a job that is a job outside of book writing, is it?
That's correct. I am a marketing director for kids and family films. So I do a lot in the way of marketing and ad budgets and kind of everything to get people aware of the movies that we're putting out. So it's a exciting job, but it also, does mean that I need to be rather proactive as far as balancing my time between work and writing.
On the bio on your website, it listed you as having studied acting at the University of California, Los Angeles, which is UCLA. And in addition to being an author of books, you're also a playwright. Is that information correct?
It is. It is. Growing up, I didn't think I would be a writer. I was really passionate about becoming an actor. I did a lot of theater as a kid and even into my beyond. I went, as you mentioned, to UCLA for theater. And from there, actually, one of the theater companies I was with started doing short play nights because initially I had no idea that I could write a full play or even a full book. But the idea of writing a short scene, writing a short play that's maybe 5 minutes long, 10 minutes long, that felt much more approachable to me. So, kind of just for fun, I started to get into that. Really, where I realized that, oh, I really enjoy directing this, where the story goes. So, I've always loved being a storyteller, which I could do as an actor. And when I realized that I could actually figure out what the story would be as a writer, that really got me into playwriting and novel writing. My first standalone play went up at the Hollywood Fringe Festival a few years ago, and it was a magical experience seeing the words I had written down suddenly coming alive on stage.
Now, does your work as a playwright and in theater help you as a book author, and if so, how?
Yes, 100%. So I've been told that I write in a theatrical way, in the way that I, visualize what the scene looks like in the same way as an actor. I need to think about how I'd be, how the scene is blocked and kind of thinking about that as well as getting into character. So all of my experience as an actor, it's really helped me because I've been used to getting into a character's head and thinking about how they would react. So once I became more focused on writing, it was really helpful to dive into the characters' heads, think about what they like, what they don't like, and really flesh them out, making them more realistic because as human as possible makes them the most compelling characters. So I think my experience in theater has really helped with that.
Thank you for appearing on the Heartland Author podcast, Brandie June. It has been wonderful to interview you today.
Wonderful. Thank you again so much for having me. This has been a pleasure.
It was an honor to interview Brandie, and I've included links to both the Amazon page for Gold Spun and Brandie's author website in the episode description. This is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding y'all to write your imagination. Bye for now. You can learn more about me and my book writing projects at authoraac.wordpress.com. You can also follow me on Facebook and Twitter at authoraac. You can also watch videos on the Heartland Author channel on YouTube. Copyright 2021, Aaron Apollo Camp, all rights reserved. This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of its audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this podcast episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.